3 minutes past midnight. The water temperature was 14 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just starts eating you from the inside out, starting at the fingers, moving up the arms, telling your brain to shut down and let go. And somewhere in that black water, 4.2 kilometers from a coastline bristling with night vision cameras, buried seismic sensors, and motorized patrols cycling every 40 minutes like clockwork, 4 men from the Special Boat Service were already swimming, not diving, not deploying submersibles, not running signal jamming protocols or launching suppression drones, swimming in the dark toward a position that NATO analysts had spent 11 days classifying as practically impenetrable. 11 days of planning. 4 men who didn't need 11 days because they were already on the other side. That's the story. And if you've never heard of the Special Boat Service before tonight, that's exactly the point. That's always been the point, because the SBS doesn't exist in the places where military glory gets written. They don't exist in the headlines or the press briefings or the Hollywood films. They exist in the water, in the dark, in the gap between what conventional forces say is impossible and what quietly, surgically, without any fanfare whatsoever, gets done anyway. And what got done on that coastline? What 4 soaking wet operators with the first stages of hypothermia setting into their hands managed to achieve against a defended position that had resisted 11 days of coalition planning is one of the most quietly devastating demonstrations of what extreme human competence looks like when it's stripped of every technological crutch and forced to operate on nothing but training, darkness, and the cold movement of the sea. Let's back up, because to understand what the SBS pulled off, you have to understand what everybody else was dealing with. And what everybody else was dealing with was a nightmare. The target was a coastal command node, a communications complex buried a few meters from the shoreline, its above-ground structures minimal, its operational infrastructure mostly underground, and its defensive envelope designed by people who understood exactly how the coalition would try to approach it. The sea in front of it was shallow, only 1.8 meters of depth at 200 meters out from the shore. And that shallow water was not an oversight in the design. It was a feature, because pressure sensors on the seabed turned that shallow approach into a detection grid. Any diver using a rebreather, any underwater propulsion vehicle, any submersible insertion platform would create pressure displacement patterns that the sensors were specifically calibrated to recognize and flag. The water that looked like a weakness was actually the strongest part of the perimeter. The flanks were no better. Villages on both sides, civilian population, active informants whose loyalties were unclear enough that any ground approach risked compromise before boots even hit the wire. The rear, open terrain, roads, zero concealment, and the air above the complex was monitored with radar coverage that had been specifically upgraded after previous coalition surveillance attempts had been tracked and catalogued. This was not a position that had grown carelessly. This was a position that had been deliberately, intelligently hardened against every tool that modern Western militaries rely on. And you have to understand what that looks like, from the inside of a coalition planning cell, to feel the weight of what was happening there. These aren't people who give up easily. These are professionals. Senior military officers, intelligence analysts with decades of experience, the access to surveillance assets that can read a license plate from the edge of the atmosphere. And they were sitting in rooms with satellite imagery pinned to boards and looking at each other and running the numbers and coming up empty. 11 days. 11 days of running options, eliminating them, trying new approaches, hitting dead ends. The SEALs had been looked at. The SEALs were there, available, willing, and extraordinarily capable. They had insertion submersibles. They had closed-circuit rebreathers that produce zero-bubble signature. They had underwater propulsion vehicles that could cross open water faster than any swimmer, and every single option involving SEAL insertion was scrubbed by the analysts because the thing that made the SEALs so formidable in the water, their technology, their gear, or their sophisticated equipment, was exactly the thing that the sensor grid was designed to detect. The more advanced the insertion hardware, the more detectable the approach. It was an elegant trap, and the more you threw at it, the tighter it got. NATO wanted a solution. No one was delivering one, and somewhere in that room, in that frustrated, exhausted, professionally humiliated collection of some of the best military minds the Western world had available, someone said the words that changed the conversation. The SBS had a proposal. The reaction in that room, and you can imagine it, because human institutional dynamics are universal, was not enthusiasm. The Special Boat Service is not the SAS. It doesn't have the same brand recognition. It doesn't carry the same cultural weight in the imagination of conventional commanders. The SAS has a mythology. The SBS has a reputation, but it's quieter, more specific, built in maritime environments that don't generate the same cinematic images as desert raids and hostage rescues. To a room full of American generals and NATO officers, the SBS, presenting itself as the solution to a problem that had stumped SEAL team planners, was not immediately convincing. There were 14 words spoken in that room by a senior coalition commander whose name doesn't matter, that captured the institutional skepticism precisely. 4 men cannot accomplish what we have been unable to plan for 11 days. 4 men. The SBS liaison had not presented a battalion option or a task force option. He had presented 4 operators, a window of opportunity dictated by tidal conditions, and a method of approach that, when described, he sounded so simple that several people in the room initially thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. But to understand why it wasn't, you have to understand something about the SBS that doesn't appear in any public recruitment brochure. Because the SBS doesn't have a public recruitment brochure. The SBS selects from the Royal Marines, specifically from the swimmer-canoeist specialization, which is itself already a filter so brutal that most people who attempt it never get through. You start as a Royal Marine, which means you've already survived training that breaks recruits in ways that recruit physical fitness doesn't prepare you for. Then you specialize in amphibious operations. Then you go further. Then you go further again. By the time an operator earns a place in the Special Boat Service, they have been systematically dismantled and rebuilt multiple times. Not rebuilt as a better version of what they were. Rebuilt as something categorically different. And the specific thing that makes an SBS operator categorically different is not the weapons they carry, or the communications equipment they operate, or the infiltration platforms they train on. It's what happens in cold water, in the dark, under conditions that would be medically classified as incompatible with sustained operational function for the vast majority of trained military personnel. The SBS trains extensively in open water, not pools, not controlled maritime environments with safety divers and thermal monitoring and extraction protocols. Open water, cold water, the kind of water that takes away your dexterity before it takes away your cognition, so that by the time your brain starts telling you something is wrong, your hands are already too numb to do anything about it. They train in it over and over and over, until the physiological experience of cold water stops being a crisis and starts being an environment. until the panic reflex that cold water triggers in normal human beings, even highly trained normal human beings, has been compressed down through repetition into something manageable, something workable, not eliminated. The SBS will tell you clearly that the fear doesn't go away, because any operator who claims the fear goes away is lying to you or lying to himself. What changes is the relationship to the fear. You learn that you can be afraid and still move. But you learn that the hands that are going numb can still function if you have built the muscle memory deep enough that function doesn't require sensation. You learn that the ocean is not your enemy. It is an environment, and every environment has rules, and the operator who understands the rules of the environment better than the defenders who are trying to use it as a barrier is not at a disadvantage. He's at an advantage they cannot measure. That's what the SBS liaison understood about the problem that 11 days of NATO planning had failed to crack. The trap set for conventional insertion was a technology trap. The pressure sensors, the radar, the detection grids, they were designed to catch hardware. How they were designed to catch submersibles and rebreathers and propulsion vehicles and all the expensive, sophisticated tools that modern special operations forces depend on, because modern special operations forces have operated in an era of such overwhelming technological advantage that the ability to function without technology has atrophied in most units. Not in the SBS. The SBS exists in the gap. The SBS was built, philosophically and operationally, for exactly the moment when the technology doesn't work and the man still has to get where he's going. The 4 men selected for the operation had a combined open-water operational experience that would take paragraphs to list fully. What you need to know is this. They had swum in conditions like this before. They had operated in water colder than this before. They had navigated in total darkness, using nothing but tidal charts and internalized knowledge of how coastal water moves before. They were not attempting something unknown. They were executing something practiced. That distinction between attempting the unknown and executing the practiced is the entire psychological distance between the men who go into the water and the men who write the reports afterward, trying to explain how they survived it. The insertion point was 4.2 kilometers from the target. They entered the water at 23:40. No rebreathers, those create detectable signatures. No underwater propulsion vehicles, same problem. 5mm neoprene wetsuits, which offer thermal protection up to a point and then stop offering it. Because there is a point at which the physics of heat loss in 14-degree water exceeds the physics of neoprene insulation, and the body starts losing the argument. Their weapons and equipment were sealed in waterproof bags strapped tight to their bodies, and they began to swim. Surface swimming, not beneath the water, not with faces submerged and tanks cycling oxygen, on the surface in the dark, moving at the rhythm of the water itself. This is the operational insight that the planning cell had failed to consider, and it failed to consider it because it fell below the threshold of what serious military planners take seriously in the age of autonomous systems and precision munitions. Radar scans the horizon looking for objects that displace radar energy in the signature patterns of boats, vehicles, large floating objects. And sonar hunts for propeller cavitation and pressure displacement from engines and propulsion systems. Pressure sensors on the seabed flag the passage of objects with mass distributions consistent with submersibles and divers. Not one of those detection systems, not one, was calibrated for the radar cross-section and pressure signature of 4 human heads at water level, moving with the current, presenting less surface profile than a piece of driftwood. You cannot detect what you are not looking for. and no one was looking for men who swam. The tide that night was running parallel to the coast, moving east toward the flank of the complex. They didn't fight it. They used it. This is something that takes years to understand properly, not intellectually, because any reasonable person can understand the concept of using a current. But in the body, in the muscles and the timing and the intuitive reading of water movement that comes only from thousands of hours spent in it. They moved with the tidal flow, conserving energy, maintaining body temperature through the very act of efficient movement, keeping their faces to the side, breathing through their noses, eyes open in water so dark it made no practical difference whether they were open or closed. 2 hours and 17 minutes in 14-degree water. The cold works on a schedule. First the hands, the fingers losing precision and then sensation, then the feet, then the arms begin reporting in slower, and the mental calculation shifts from what you can do to what you can still do with what you have left. An SBS operator in that water isn't thinking about the cold the way a civilian would, isn't catastrophizing, isn't running survival calculations. He is managing it the way you manage a variable in a mathematical problem you've solved before, acknowledging its presence and building the solution around its constraint, rather than pretending it isn't there. At 2 hours and 17 minutes, the first man's hands touched sand, not the beach, the seabed, 40 meters out, in water shallow enough to crawl. They crawled, on their hands and knees on the ocean floor, faces at water level, moving toward shore across the last 40 meters in the slowest, most controlled movement you can imagine. Because rushing is sound, and sound is detection, and detection at 40 meters is a problem with no good solution. They emerged from the water onto the beach in the dead gap between two camera arcs, a dead zone that the designers of the perimeter defense system had documented in their own paperwork as a zone of guaranteed overlap. It was not a zone of guaranteed overlap. It was 3 meters of uncovered ground that represented either a surveying error or a documentation error, and the difference between a surveying error and a documentation error matters enormously in any operational context. But on that beach, at that moment, what it meant in practice was 3 meters of blind ground that 4 men could come through without triggering an alarm. 3 meters. Between 11 days of failed planning and a successful infiltration of what NATO had classified as a practically impenetrable position, there were 3 meters of overlooked sand. They had been on the beach for less than 4 minutes when the first patrol cycle ended and the motorized unit completed its pass without stopping. They had moved off the sand and into the shadow of the outer perimeter structure before the second cycle began. The temperature of their hands was low enough that gripping a rifle required conscious attention, a deliberate mental override of what the nervous system was reporting about the state of their extremities, because the nervous system at that temperature is giving you information about sensation, and what you need is information about function, and those two things are not the same. This is the difference. This is the thing that no amount of fitness testing or academic examination can reveal about a man, whether when his hands are telling him they cannot hold a weapon, that he can reach beneath that message to the layer of trained movement that doesn't require sensation to execute. The SBS had built that layer. It had been built through years of doing exactly this in training environments that weren't simulating misery for its own sake, but for the specific purpose of building a physiological library deep enough to draw from when the body starts lying about its own capabilities. 22 minutes. That's the window documented in the Joint Operational Report for what happened next. And 22 minutes is a strange unit of time when you try to imagine what happens inside it. 22 minutes of 4 men, wet and cold, moving through a defensive structure that had been designed by people who knew their business. The neutralizing defensive positions with a precision that came not from numerical advantage or technological superiority, but from the quality of planning that can only emerge when the men doing the planning have internalized the environment so completely that adaptation is instantaneous. There was no comms support within viable range, no quick reaction force positioned close enough to be relevant, no air cover, no drone overwatch, no signals intelligence feed running in their earpieces telling them where everyone was. There was a tidal chart that had been memorized before they entered the water. There was a physical layout of the complex that had been studied until it existed as spatial memory rather than recalled information. And there were 4 men whose individual and collective competence in this specific type of close-quarters maritime environment represented decades of accumulated institutional knowledge that the British military had been building and refining since the Second World War. The alarm never activated. That's the line in the report that civilian readers pass over too quickly, so read it again. The alarm never activated. In a position with electronic surveillance, with patrols, with defensive personnel, with a hardened communications complex that represented a significant operational asset and was therefore guarded accordingly. The alarm never activated. This is not luck. Luck is a word that gets applied retroactively to outcomes whose causes are too complex or too uncomfortable to fully articulate. What produced that outcome was not luck. It was the specific, granular, deeply boring work of preparation. The SBS operators knew the patrol cycles because they had spent time before the operation studying the patterns, cross-referencing signal intelligence with visual reconnaissance, building a model of the perimeter's rhythm that was precise enough to work inside. They knew the camera coverage because the gap in the documentation had been found by someone whose job it was to look for exactly that kind of discrepancy, and whose training had included the specific discipline of reading defensive systems, not for what they cover, but for what they miss. They knew where to move and when to stop, and how long a pause in one position bought them in terms of the next movement window. And they executed on that knowledge with a mechanical fluency that looks from the outside like something almost supernatural, and is from the inside the result of 10,000 repetitions in conditions designed specifically to make the repetitions harder than the real thing. The assault element was called, the path was open, the complex was compromised. The operation was over before the planning cell had finished its latest risk assessment revision. Let's talk about what it costs, because this is the part that never makes it into the YouTube thumbnails or the documentaries with the night vision footage and the dramatic music. The part that is almost never discussed publicly about units like the SBS is what the sustained operation of human beings at this level does to the human beings. Not the mission, the career, the years. The cumulative weight of operating in cold water, in darkness, in isolation from conventional support structures, across multiple operational deployments, across years of training that is designed to push past the limits of what the body reports as sustainable. 4 men came out of the water that night with hands that, under medical examination, showed the circulatory effects of extended cold water immersion. Not frostbite, not injury, but not unchanged either. The body keeps a ledger. Every cold water insertion makes an entry. Every night operation, every sleep deprivation protocol, every mission where the stress hormones run at operational levels for extended periods, and the nervous system operates in a state of sustained vigilance. Every one of those makes an entry. The SBS operators who talked about the physical cost of their careers in the limited and carefully controlled ways that any of them ever discuss anything publicly, describe a specific kind of accounting that happens in the body over time. Joints that report in the morning before the rest of the body is awake. A persistent quality to certain kinds of cold that didn't exist before a specific number of operational years had passed. Dreams that don't always distinguish between the remembered and the anticipated, not complaining, not asking for anything, just accounting. The reason they keep going is not because they don't feel the cost. Any operator who tells you the cost is irrelevant is performing a version of themselves designed for consumption. The real reason, the reason that the men who have served in units like the SBS describe with a consistency that crosses national and cultural lines, is something older and simpler than any doctrine or institutional narrative. It's the person to your left and the person to your right. It's the knowledge accumulated through years of shared suffering in training and shared exposure in operations, that the man next to you has paid the same price and will pay it again, and that whatever happens in the water, in the dark, under circumstances that no planning cell predicted, you are not alone with it. This is not sentimentality. Sentimentality is cheap and operational environments burn it away very quickly. This is something structural, a mutual accountability between men who have been to the limits of what they can physically and psychologically sustain, who know each other's limits precisely because they were present when those limits were found and tested and found again, and who have arrived at a shared understanding that the mission continues not because the suffering is over, but because the brotherhood makes the suffering bearable in a way that nothing individual ever could. The debriefing happened the following day. American officers, NATO liaison personnel, British command staff, a room full of people whose job it was to understand what had happened well enough to write reports about it that would inform future doctrine. The questions were professional, detailed, methodical, and at the end of the technical interrogation, when every movement in the approach had been mapped and every decision in the breach had been analyzed, and the timeline had been reconstructed minute by minute, someone asked the question that everyone in the room had been holding since the operation ended. The senior American officer. He'd been running special operations planning for long enough that there was nothing theatrical about the question. He asked it straight. What was the contingency plan if they were detected in the water? The SBS commander's answer has been cited in various forms in discussions about special operations doctrine that are significantly less public than this video. The answer was 5 words. 5 words that contained, in compressed form, the entire philosophical difference between what the SBS had just accomplished and what the planning cell had spent 11 days failing to accomplish. He said, "Swim faster." That was it. No QRF plan. No extraction submersible positioned at a safe standoff distance. No drone overhead running protective overwatch. No signals team ready to jam the target's communications if the approach was detected. The contingency was the men. The contingency was always the men. Specifically the specific men selected for this specific operation, whose competence in open water movement under duress was, according to the operational assessment, sufficient to constitute a viable contingency plan in the absence of all external support. Swim faster. 2 words of operational guidance containing the entire weight of everything those men had built across years of training that most human beings would not survive, and most trained military personnel would not choose to endure past the first serious contact with its reality. The room was quiet for a moment after that answer. Not dramatically quiet, not the silence of a movie beat designed to land an emotional note. The quiet of people whose profession involves the analytical assessment of risk, and whose instruments for making that assessment had just encountered something that didn't map cleanly onto the frameworks those instruments were built to evaluate. Because the frameworks are built around hardware, around platforms and capabilities and support structures and redundancies and QRF protocols and medevac windows. Yeah, around the architecture of modern special operations, which is extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily expensive and ordinarily dependent on a support infrastructure that the SBS had just operated entirely without. How do you write a lessons-learned document about 4 men who swam 4 kilometers in the dark with numb hands and no extraction plan? How do you encode into doctrine the operational logic of an answer that is, at its core, a statement about the absolute primacy of human competence over everything else? How do you brief that up the chain to commanders who have spent careers building the case for investment in the systems and platforms and technologies that those 4 men just rendered irrelevant for one night on one coastline? You don't write that doctrine. You cannot write that doctrine. Because the doctrine would require you to produce men who can function the way those 4 men functioned. And the production of men who function that way takes more than a training program. It takes a selection philosophy that is willing to lose most of the candidates it starts with. It takes an institutional culture that values the accumulation of hard experience over the accumulation of certifications. It takes the kind of sustained organizational commitment to genuine difficulty that is, in practice, almost impossible to maintain in any institution large enough to have budget cycles and performance reviews and promotion boards and all the human systemic pressures that operate against the preservation of genuinely hard things. The SBS is small enough and old enough and sufficiently insulated from those pressures by its operational record and its institutional culture that it has maintained what it is. Most organizations cannot do that. The SBS can and does, and on a beach somewhere in the Middle East on a night when NATO was still debating which planning window was least suicidal, 4 men from that organization demonstrated why that matters at a level that no budget line item and no capability assessment and no force structure analysis can fully capture. Here's what you do with that. Here is what the commanders who debriefed those 4 men and wrote the reports and attended the follow-up assessments and sat with what they had just witnessed eventually arrived at. Out in the private conversations and the off-record discussions and the moments where professional performance could drop enough to let actual understanding in. The standard model of modern conflict resolution is based on the assumption that superiority of resources, better technology, more firepower, bigger logistics chains, more intelligence coverage, more everything, is the fundamental variable that determines outcomes. This assumption is correct in the aggregate and across most contexts and for most operational challenges. It is correct often enough that it has become not just a planning assumption, but a kind of ideological commitment, a way of understanding what military power means that shapes not just procurement decisions, but the imagination of what's possible. And then something like this happens. Then 4 men with no equipment and no QRF and a contingency plan that consists entirely of the phrase, swim faster, go somewhere that $40 million in technology couldn't go, and do what 11 days of professional planning couldn't accomplish, and come back with the path open and the target compromised, and every commander in that room has to sit with the quiet, uncomfortable understanding that the model doesn't explain what just happened, that there exists, somewhere in the relationship between extreme human preparation and the specific demands of a specific environment, a capability that the model cannot produce, and the model cannot replicate, and the model cannot, if it's being honest with itself, fully account for. The Special Boat Service is not the answer to everything. They are not a force that scales. You cannot build an army of SBS operators any more than you can build an army of concert pianists. The qualities required for the thing are inherently and deliberately scarce. What the SBS is a proof of concept, a standing demonstration that the human capacity for competence, built through deliberate suffering across sustained time, can produce operational capability that exists outside the parameters of every quantitative assessment tool the modern military uses to plan and measure and justify and budget. They are the evidence against the completeness of the model. They are the organizational embodiment of the thing that military history has been saying for as long as war has existed, and that every generation of modern military planners has to learn again in some new specific form. That the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is not the most expensive or the most technologically advanced. It's the most prepared, the most certain, the most willing to go into cold water in the dark, with nothing but training and trust in the people swimming beside them. The most human, in the specific sense that humanity contains within it, at its extreme and carefully cultivated edge, a kind of capability that no machine has yet been able to replicate, because the machine cannot be afraid and keep moving anyway, cannot feel its hands going numb and choose to grip harder. They cannot be 2 kilometers from a hostile shore in 14-degree water at 2 in the morning and decide, in the absolute absence of backup and support and alternatives, that this is fine, because this is what they trained for, and the man to the left and the man to the right trained for it too. 4 men, 11 days, 3 meters of uncovered sand, an alarm that never activated, a planning cell that went quiet, a room that had no doctrine for what it had just witnessed. The SBS swam home.